we can solve the mystery beyond doubt of who this skeleton actually is. None other than Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, Egyptian rebel, Queen of Egypt.
For 2,000 years, Cleopatra has existed in our imagination as a single image, the seductress on a barge, the woman whose beauty toppled two of Rome's most powerful men. But that image was never built on biology. It was built on propaganda, poetry, and Hollywood casting. Now, a wave of genetic and forensic science is trying to do something no historian ever could: strip away the myth and look directly at the body underneath. And what scientists are finding is not a love story. It is a warning written in DNA, a story about a dynasty that may have engineered its own destruction, generation after generation, through one of the oldest and most dangerous practices in royal history. To understand why this search matters so much, you have to understand why Cleopatra has been so hard to find in the first place. Unlike most pharaohs, she has no confirmed tomb. No mummy. No skeleton sitting in a museum case waiting to be tested. The Ptolemaic dynasty she belonged to ruled from Alexandria, a city that has spent 2 millennia being swallowed by earthquakes, tidal surges, and its own rebuilding. Entire palace districts now sit underwater in the harbor. For most of modern history, the working assumption among Egyptologists was simple and a little sad: Cleopatra's remains, wherever they once were, are almost certainly gone for good. That assumption didn't sit well with everyone. For the last 2 decades, a Dominican lawyer turned archaeologist named Kathleen Martinez has been arguing that everyone was looking in the wrong place entirely. Her background is unusual for the field. She spent years working criminal cases before she ever picked up a trowel, and she approached Cleopatra's disappearance less like a historical puzzle and more like an unsolved case file. Her instinct told her that Cleopatra, a deeply religious woman who saw herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, would have wanted to be buried somewhere sacred to that identity, not in the secular heart of Alexandria. That instinct pointed her roughly 30 miles west, to a half-forgotten temple complex called Taposiris Magna. Martinez and her team have spent years excavating that site, and in 2022 they uncovered something that genuinely surprised the broader archaeological community: a tunnel cut directly through bedrock, stretching more than 4,000 feet toward the Mediterranean coastline. Engineers who studied it compared its construction to the ancient tunnel of Eupalinos on Samos, one of the most celebrated feats of engineering from the ancient Greek world. A passage of that scale and precision is not something you build for a minor shrine. It signals that whoever commissioned it considered this site enormously important enough to justify tunneling through unstable rock toward the sea, possibly toward a submerged harbor structure that has also been identified nearby. Martinez believes this network may eventually lead toward a royal burial chamber, though as of now, no sarcophagus bearing Cleopatra's name has been recovered, and that part of the theory remains unproven. What has been found inside the temple complex is, in its own way, just as striking. Excavators uncovered a series of rock-cut tombs containing mummified remains, and inside the mouths of several of these individuals were small amulets made of gold foil, shaped to rest where the tongue would have been. In ancient Egyptian funerary belief, the dead needed to address Osiris, lord of the underworld, to be granted passage into the afterlife. A golden tongue was thought to grant the deceased the eloquence to make that case. Martinez has suggested these individuals may have been courtiers or attendants connected to Cleopatra's court, possibly positioned here in anticipation of a much grander royal burial nearby. It's an evocative theory, but it remains a theory. There is no DNA evidence yet directly linking these burials to the queen herself. Which brings us to the part of this story where science actually delivered a verdict, just not the one anyone expected. For decades, researchers believed they already possessed a genetic window into Cleopatra's family through the bones of the sister she had murdered. That sister was Arsinoe IV, and her relationship with Cleopatra was nothing like sisterly affection. It was rivalry in its rawest form. When Cleopatra was forced into exile by political enemies in the Egyptian court, it was Arsinoe who briefly seized power. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and found himself trapped in the royal palace during a local uprising, it was Arsinoe who commanded the opposing forces, a teenage princess directing an army against Rome's most famous general. She lost. She was captured, shipped to Rome, and paraded in chains during Caesar's triumph, a humiliation so visibly cruel that Roman crowds reportedly wept at the sight of her. That public sympathy is likely what spared her life. She was exiled instead of executed, sent to live out her days at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in what is now western Turkey, a sanctuary that was supposed to guarantee her safety. It didn't. In 41 BCE, at Cleopatra's urging, Mark Antony ordered Arsinoe killed on the temple steps, a violation of sacred ground that scandalized the ancient world. For 2,000 years afterward, nobody knew exactly where her body had ended up, until the 20th century, when archaeologists working in Ephesus uncovered an octagonal tomb structure that came to be known simply as the octagon. Inside was a skeleton, and based on its location, its estimated age, and the timeline of Arsinoe's death, many researchers came to believe they had found her. If true, this skeleton represented something extraordinary, a genetic doorway into Cleopatra's own bloodline, since the two women shared a father. Early attempts to extract usable DNA from the remains failed, undone by decades of handling and contamination. But the skull itself had been documented with photographs and measurements before it was lost during the chaos of the Second World War, only resurfacing decades later in storage at the University of Vienna. Those old measurements became the foundation of a much bigger argument. An Austrian archaeologist named Hilke Thursday examined the data and proposed that the skull's features suggested African maternal ancestry. If correct, and if this individual really was Arsinoe, the implication would ripple outward into one of the most contested questions in classical history: was Cleopatra herself, so often depicted as purely Macedonian Greek, actually of mixed heritage? The idea fit into a much older and broader scholarly debate about the African identity of ancient Egyptian civilization, a debate that has surfaced again and again in academic writing and, more recently, in popular media. Then, in January 2025, a team from the University of Vienna led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber published new findings in the journal Scientific Reports, and the results upended everything the octagon skeleton had seemed to promise. Using micro-CT imaging and DNA extracted from the petra's bone, the densest part of the skull, often the last place where genetic material survives intact, the researchers determined the skeleton was not a 20-year-old woman at all. It belonged to a boy, somewhere between 11 and 14 years old, who showed signs of severe developmental abnormalities, including a misshapen jaw and cranial asymmetry consistent with a serious congenital condition. Genetic markers further suggested ancestry tracing back toward Italy, not Egypt. Whoever this child was, he was not Arsinoe, and the skeleton that had anchored an entire theory about Cleopatra's ancestry for decades turned out to belong to someone else's tragedy entirely. It remains unclear who he actually was, why he was buried in such a prestigious tomb, or what his connection, if any, was to the Ptolemaic or Roman elite. So the search for a direct genetic sample from Cleopatra's bloodline effectively starts over. But that doesn't mean science has nothing to say about who she was biologically. It means we have to look at the family she came from, and that family tree tells a story that is arguably more disturbing than any DNA test could reveal on its own. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and like several ancient royal lines, it tried to preserve its power and bloodline through intermarriage between close relatives. This wasn't an occasional cousin marriage. Historians widely believe Cleopatra's own parents were full siblings, and her grandparents may have shared an equally close relationship. Estimates of her resulting coefficient of inbreeding, essentially the statistical likelihood that she inherited identical gene copies from both parents, run as high as 45%. For comparison, the children of first cousins typically sit around 6%. Spain's Habsburg dynasty, infamous for the genetic collapse that produced Charles II, a king so afflicted by congenital illness that he reportedly could not chew solid food and died childless at 38, is estimated to have reached around 25% in its final generations. Cleopatra's family had pushed nearly twice as far down that road. In genetic terms, what happens in these situations is called increased homozygosity. A child normally inherits 2 different versions of each gene, one from each parent, and a healthy version from one side can often compensate for a damaged one from the other. When parents are close relatives, that safety net disappears. Harmful recessive traits that would normally stay hidden have nowhere to hide, and they surface instead as physical and developmental disorders. Historical accounts of Cleopatra's male relatives read almost like a slow-motion case study in exactly this kind of genetic decline. Her great-granduncle, Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon or Potbelly, was described by ancient writers as so obese and physically weakened that he had to be supported while walking, with descriptions of a swollen neck and bulging eyes that some modern medical historians have speculated could point toward a thyroid disorder such as Graves' disease. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, was remembered as soft, self-indulgent, and politically ineffective, traits historians have traditionally read as character flaws but which, layered onto this family's medical history, might just as easily be symptoms. And this is where Cleopatra's story becomes genuinely strange, because by every surviving account, she didn't fit that pattern at all. She was remembered as sharp, multilingual, tireless, and politically formidable in a way none of her siblings managed to be. Her brother Ptolemy XIII drowned during a military collapse in his teens. Her sister Arsinoe was executed in exile. If the octagon boy in Ephesus does turn out to have any connection to this family, his deformities fit the broader pattern of a bloodline under genetic strain. Cleopatra, by contrast, lived to 39, bore 4 children with 2 different men, and personally commanded fleets and armies. Either she beat extraordinary genetic odds and inherited an unusually clean combination of traits despite her ancestry, or she carried hidden burdens that history simply never recorded: chronic pain, metabolic stress, or the kind of restless, high-intensity energy that some medical historians now wonder might align with an undiagnosed thyroid condition rather than pure force of personality. It's worth noting, too, that Cleopatra appears to have taken an active interest in medicine and chemistry in her own right. She is credited with writing a treatise on cosmetics, fragments of which were later cited by physicians like Galen, and ancient writers describe her experimenting with substances ranging from incense believed to have calming properties to mild psychoactive plants. None of this proves she was self-medicating a hidden illness, but it does complicate the picture of her as simply a natural beauty relying on charm alone. She was, by the evidence we do have, someone deeply engaged with the practical chemistry of her era, whether out of curiosity, vanity, necessity, or some mixture of all three. All of this leaves us in a strange position. The skeleton that was supposed to give us Cleopatra's genetic fingerprint turned out to belong to someone else entirely. The tomb that might one day hold her own remains is still sealed beneath the bedrock at Taposiris Magna, and Kathleen Martinez's team continues digging, inch by inch, toward whatever lies at the end of that tunnel. Until that door opens, everything we know about Cleopatra's actual biology has to be pieced together secondhand, through the documented suffering and decline of the relatives who shared her bloodline. What's clear is that the woman behind the legend was almost certainly not the flawless icon she's been turned into across 2,000 years of art and film. She was the product of one of history's most extreme experiments in dynastic inbreeding, a family line that produced obesity, deformity, and early death in generation after generation around her. Whether she escaped that legacy through sheer genetic luck, or quietly carried its weight behind a carefully managed public image, may not be answerable until real genetic material from her own remains is finally recovered. Until then, the most accurate portrait of Cleopatra isn't the seductress on the barge. It's a woman who may have spent her entire life fighting 2 wars at once, one against Rome, and possibly one against her own body. If Martinez's tunnel ever does lead to a sealed chamber bearing the Queen's remains, the discovery will do more than settle a historical debate. It will finally let science ask Cleopatra the questions 2,000 years of myth never could.